So in this tutorial we're going to be creating a custom CSS checkbox, and we'll be replacing it with a kind of slide toggle with on and off states. Now there are some usability and user experience things that you need to consider when doing this sort of thing, but it's quite a nice exercise to see how you could replace some of the built-in HTML inputs and controls and replace them with your own actual custom controls. So let's go and have a look at how you would create your own custom checkbox using just CSS. So in order to start writing our custom CSS checkbox, I've set up a small project. I'm just going to take you through a little bit of what we've got here now. In the package.json file, I've installed a dev dependency of parcel, which we're going to be using to bundle our files. And the reason I'm using that is just so that I can make use of Sass. So we're going to be writing our styles in Sass just because it'll make it a little bit easier to handle the hierarchy of the components that we're using. And it also gives us a built-in dev server as well, which I've set up as a script. So here you can see parcel serve, and I'm serving this index file that I've created. So that's the only other thing in the project really. In the source folder, I've got two files. I've got index.html and styles.scss. So the index page is where we're going to be writing a little bit of markup in order to display our custom checkbox. And then of course styles is where we're going to be actually writing all of the styles to actually customize the way that looks. So let's get cracking now by writing the markup. There's only a little bit, so it won't take us too long. So the first thing I'm going to do is just create a containing div element, which will be the overall container for the actual custom CSS checkbox. And I'm just going to give that a class. We can say something like custom checkbox, for example. You can call it anything you like as long as we use the same selector when we're writing our styles. So in here, I'm actually going to put a HTML input element, and this will be the actual checkbox. So we actually need a checkbox on the page to make this work. And I'm going to give this an ID of status, so we can target that in a second with our CSS. And we'll set the type to checkbox and just close that tag there. So if we save the page now and just go over to the browser, you should see we've just got that checkbox there, which we can tick on and off. Of course, we don't want to actually show that to the user. We want to actually show them the custom slide toggle that we're going to be creating. And we're going to put that inside of a label. And you'll see the reason why we're using a label in just a second. But if we match the for property of status to the same ID of the checkbox that we just created a second ago, you'll see we'll be able to use this label to actually toggle the state of the checkbox on and off. So if I, for example, just put something in here saying label, save that and go back to the page, you can see when we tick the checkbox, it obviously goes on and off. But if we actually click the label element as well, you can see because the ID and the for attributes are the same, we can actually use that label tag as well to actually toggle the state of the checkbox. So I'm just going to remove that text there now because we don't want that to display to the user, but I will put some extra content into the label, and I'm just going to put an extra div inside there. And I'm going to give this a class of status switch. So this will be what we're going to actually use to display the toggle to the user. And we can target this with our styles in a second. And I'm also going to put a couple of extra properties on this as well. One for data unchecked. So this will be the text we'll display to the user when the checkbox is off or hasn't been checked. And also the data checked property. So the data checked property will actually be the text that will display to the user when the slide toggle is active, or in other words, when the checkbox has been checked. So if we save that now and go back to the page, you'll see we're just back to our checkbox because the div hasn't got any content in at the moment, so you can't actually see that at this point. So let's start writing some CSS to actually start styling, in particular, this status switch class here. So let's head over to the styles.scss file. So the first thing I'm going to do is target the actual containing element that we created. So if you remember, we created a div with a class of custom checkbox, which holds the overall content here. So I'm just going to target that first of all. So what I'm going to do in here is actually set an overall height and width for the slide toggle that we're creating. So we'll give it a pixel width of 340 and a height of 80. And inside of here, I'm going to create some more rules, and because we're using Sass, we can nest all of this. I'm not going to go too crazy on using all of Sass's features, but certainly using the ability to nest rules inside of each other is going to be really handy for us to understand what's going on with our checkbox. So the first thing I'm going to do is get a reference to the input that we create. So this is the actual checkbox itself. And first thing I'm going to do is just say the display of that is none, because we don't actually want to show the checkbox on the page. So if we save that and go back to our page, you can see we've actually got nothing appearing now. So we need to start making some changes to the label and the div inside it so that the user has got something to actually interact with. And the first thing we're going to do is work with the unchecked state. So this will be the state of the slide toggle when the checkbox is unchecked. So the first thing I'm going to do is target the label that's actually adjacent to the input checkbox. And I can do that by using the adjacent sibling selector, which is this plus symbol here. And then I was saying I want to select the label that's next to the input that's got the ID of status. And the first thing I want to do here is just make sure that the height and width of that is 100% of the containing element. And then inside that label, you'll remember we have the div that has the class of status switch. So let's target that now. So the first thing I'm going to do there is just set the height to 100% and also the width to 100%. And just so that we can see it on the page and the user knows that they can interact with this element, we're going to set the cursor to pointer. So if we scroll back to the page, we should, if we hover somewhere in this region here, you can see that the mouse icon is turning into a hand so that we know that there's something there to interact with. But obviously we need to put some more content in there so that it's actually visible to the user. So to do that, I'm just going to set the background color here to gray. You can choose any color that you like, but it makes sense to have something that denotes an inactive state here. And you can now see that the div that we're targeting, that status switch div, is now showing up as a block of gray. I'm also going to set the text color to white, but again, you can choose some other color if you wish. And I'm just going to add a little bit of padding and also set the border radius to 3 pixels, which will just give our slide toggle a little bit of a rounded edge, and the padding will push in the actual button inside it. So we get a little bit of border around the actual slide toggle button. And one other thing that we want to put in here before we finish off this section is to actually set the position of the element to relative. Now this is really important because we're actually going to be absolutely positioning the next elements inside of our status switch div. And if we didn't set this, the next items wouldn't be positioned correctly. So this is actually a really important rule to add into our div in order to make everything look as it should. So the next elements we're actually going to target are the before and after pseudo elements. So these are actually elements that don't actually exist on the page as such, but we can use them to actually add some more content to the status switch div. And these will be the elements that actually have the on and off text of the slide toggle. And we're going to be using the before element to have the white box that will be the slide toggle that moves from left to right. So first of all, let's set our height and width again. This time, instead of going 100%, I'm actually going to do a CSS calculation. And I'm going to say it's 100% of the containing element, which is basically the status switch div. But I'm actually going to subtract 6 pixels from that because we've got some padding on there. So we'll do that there. And then we're going to do the same sort of thing with the width. We'll say it's 100%, but we're only going to take off 3 pixels on this side. And then I'm going to set the display of these items to flex, which will basically allow me to align all of the content inside there centered. So if we use align items and justify content and set them both to center, means the text will be exactly positioned in the center of the element. And of course, the important thing here as well is we want to set the position to absolute. And finally, we'll add some border radius onto these elements as well. So we'll just say 2 pixels, for example. So if we save that, this is just the setup for the before and after pseudo elements. They still won't appear on the page. There's no content on them at the moment. So we need to set some specific rules up for both before and after. So let's target those individually. So for before, first thing we're going to do is set the background color to white, so we'll get a white box for this particular element, and we'll also set the color of the text to black. Again, you can customize these colors if you wish, and we're going to set its content to basically the attribute that we set up in the HTML, which if you remember was data unchecked, which if we check in our markup, you can see that data unchecked should be equal to the text of off. So that's some basic styling for before. If we just save that quickly and have a look in the browser, you can see we've got one element here. So this is the before pseudo element, and you can see we've got a bit of padding around that at the moment. We just need to target the after element as well and put some content into there too. So let's target that individually as well. So we'll say after, and we're going to say its content is equal to the attribute for data checked. So if we check that in the browser, you can see that it's not appearing as it should, and that's because we need to modify the positions of where each element sits. So for the before element, we're going to set that on the left-hand side. We'll just give it a 3 pixel nudge in so that we get the border around it. And for the after pseudo element, we'll just move that as far right as we can. So we'll set right equal to 0. So these should be side by side now, so I've probably made an error here somewhere. And yeah, so what we want for the width of each of these is to be 50%, so half of the actual overall div element that's containing them. So let's save that and go back. So now we're getting the off button here and the on button on the right hand side. So if we click this now, nothing happens, but what you would find if we looked at the checkbox state is that it is actually updating and that the actual checkbox is being set to on and off. But we just don't have any CSS rules to actually update this, to update the styles for when the checkbox is actually checked. So let's do that now. So what we need to do is actually just close down this section here, and we're going to actually now work on the checked state. And we don't need a huge amount of rules to actually get this to work, but first thing we want to do is, because we're inside of the input element here at the moment, we want to target it when it's actually checked. So we'll use the check pseudo selector, and we want to, again, using the symbol selector, target the label, and then we can just go and drill directly down into the status switch div, which is inside of that. And then we can set the background color to something else, so we could set it to green, for example. So let's just check that's actually working. So when we click on the checkbox, you can see that the state of the background color is actually changing. So we know we were on the right lines. We've got the right CSS selector to carry on making changes to that. So we're in the right area here. Let's just target the pseudo elements inside of the status switch. So we want to first of all target the after pseudo element. So if we have a look in the browser again, you can see this over here where we've got the on text is actually the after pseudo element. So we want to move that over to the left here and then move this element, which is the before pseudo element, over to the right. So we're basically just going to swap those two elements over. So to do that, the left of the after element is going to be set to 0. And then we want to target the before pseudo element and set the left property of this over to 50%, which will basically move it over to the right hand side of the label. So let's go back to the page and test that out. So when the status of the checkbox is unchecked, we've got the off on the left hand side and the white button is on the left hand side. And when we check the checkbox, you can see the white button moves over to the right hand side, and indeed the background color has changed to green. The only problem that we've got is because the actual button is moving over to the right hand side, it's taking the content inside it as well. So the text of off and on actually follow the elements as they move across. And we don't want that to happen because when we change in the state, we want the text to actually update as well. So let's go back to the code and change that. So for our after element, we're just going to swap out the content to be attribute, and this time it will be data unchecked. And for the before property, we're going to set the content to the attribute for data checked. So let's try that out again. So when the checkbox is checked, on is on the right hand side, and it stays on the right hand side when it's unchecked. So we can see that the pseudo elements are actually moving, but we're actually updating the text as well. So just before we wrap up, let's actually add a little bit of animation to this by using transition properties. So over here in the actual label itself, when we're looking at the status switch, so we're actually toggling the background color. So let's put a transition in for that. So we'll just say transition all, let's give it a reasonable time. Let's say 0.7 seconds and ease it in. If we save that and go back to the browser, when we flip between states now, you should see that the color fades in and out. That's probably a little bit long. Let's just take it down to about 0.4 seconds. So you can see it just fades in gently on each time that we toggle between the states. And the other transition we probably want to do is for the actual positioning of the before and after elements. So inside of this double selector here, we can target the transition. And again, we'll just target all, and we'll say 0.3 seconds, and we'll ease it in. So go back to the browser and try that out. So now you can see, because we're updating the absolutely positioned pseudo elements, and we're just mainly moving the left property, you can see that sliding in and out when we toggle between those checked and unchecked states. And a couple of last things I'll just do to finish up. I'm just going to set the color of the after pseudo element when it's actually checked. The before element I think is probably the one we want to target because that's the one that's moving. I'll just set its text color to green. So now you can see when the checkbox is checked, we get the green text on the green background, so it looks like it's just coming through from the background there. And I'll also, on the before pseudo element, so where we've got the white background, I'll just add a bit of box shadow, which will just help to lift that before element off the page, and it'll just give it a bit of depth, making it look a bit more like a slide toggle would appear in the real world. So that's pretty much it for creating your own custom CSS checkbox. As mentioned at the start of the tutorial, there are maybe some UX implications to think about, but it is quite a nice effect. And you'll see this kind of effect used in a lot of user interfaces, and it's quite a nice way of indicating to a user the status of a particular setting that they may have turned on or off. Of course, now you've got the principles of this with the hidden checkbox input and the displayed label. You can go away and come up with your own creations, and hopefully the CSS that we've looked at in this tutorial will give you an idea of where to start if you're looking at customizing the way that checkbox appears. So that's it for this tutorial. Don't forget to subscribe to support the channel and so you don't miss out on any future tutorials, and I'll see you next time.